She didn't even look up as she tossed the ID card onto the floor. An impeccably dressed bank employee standing behind the cold bulletproof glass under harsh fluorescent lights had discarded a black woman's identity documents as if they were worthless. Then she turned away at the this about it say a woman of our woman had never existed. No explanation, no apology, only the dry thud of plastic hitting tile and the suffocating silence of countless invisible eyes judging and condemning. No one spoke, no one intervened. And in that stillness, something deep began to crack. Not in this vast room, but in the heart of the woman standing there, holding on to her own proud silence. She remained perfectly still, composed, a figure none of them truly understood, yet all were quick to dismiss. Her outfit was plain business wear, her shoes scuffed and worn, and her rich brown skin, unbowed, made her at once vividly present and strangely invisible to those around her. What happened next didn't make waves, it didn't make the front page, but it held a far more potent force: wounded dignity and devalued self-worth. Natalie Coleman stepped through the main doors of Stratton Financial Bank in downtown Raleigh on a blistering afternoon. Harsh sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows, casting a blinding glare across the polished marble floors. Inside, the air was cool and flawless, with soft piano music playing as if to soothe the wealthy clientele. Natalie paused at the entrance, smoothing the lapel of her simple navy blazer and brushing back her hair. Her attire, though modest, was impeccably neat, enough to convey professionalism. She inhaled deeply and approached the teller station where a young woman, blonde hair cascading in elaborate curls, wearing a pristine white blouse and a name tag reading Jessica, was absorbed in her computer screen. Natalie waited patiently, her eyes on Jessica with the hope of a polite greeting. 1 second passed, then 2, then an awkward, interminable stretch of time. Jessica didn't look up as if Natalie didn't exist. "Hello?" Natalie said softly, breaking the unusual silence. But the only response was icy indifference. Jessica continued tapping away at her keyboard. Just then, a white man in a sharp gray suit entered, and Jessica's face lit up. She offered him a warm smile, rising swiftly to greet him with obvious enthusiasm. Natalie winced but remained steadfast. When Jessica finally glanced back at her screen, Natalie again spoke politely. "Excuse me, I'd like to make a deposit and check my account, please." Jessica frowned, but remained silent. A moment later, she slowly looked up and gave Natalie a dismissive, irritated glance. "Do you have an appointment? We only handle transactions by scheduled appointment here," she said coldly. Natalie clenched her calm, explaining that she didn't need financial advice. She simply wanted to deposit a check into her existing account. Jessica sighed impatiently and pointed toward a row of teller lanes beyond, without another word. Natalie nodded politely and moved to the indicated station. When it was her turn, she gently placed her ID and a certified check on the counter. Jessica approached, staring at the ID with suspicion. She pinched it between her fingertips as though it were filth, scrutinized it, then abruptly hurled it onto the cold stone floor with a harsh clatter. All eyes turned toward them. A stifling silence settled over the bank's grand interior. No one spoke. No one intervened. The ID lay discarded and devalued in the eyes of the witnesses. Natalie felt anger surge within her chest, but she suppressed it. Slowly, she bent down and picked up the card with calm dignity. Her eyes locked on Jessica's, in a silent blend of challenge and grace. Jessica's expression remained frozen, no hint of remorse, no trace of shame. And in that heavy silence, Natalie knew she had stepped into a quiet battle, one not just for her personal rights, but against the prejudices that surrounded her, in the very place she deserved the most basic respect. When Natalie straightened up, the ID still clenched in her hand, she realized the space around her had snapped back to a disturbingly normal state, as if the humiliation that had just occurred was invisible to everyone in the room. She drew in a deep breath, smoothed the lapel of her jacket, and stepped back from the teller's counter to await further instructions. Struggling to contain the flood of emotions welling up inside, Ashley, the receptionist, sat behind a sleek front desk at the far left of the lobby. Her carefully curled red hair and gold-rimmed fashion glasses gave her an air of quiet authority, one reserved only for those granted unspoken privilege. Natalie approached, hoping for at least a courteous explanation or direction on what to do next. But Ashley remained absorbed in her computer screen, her pastel-pink fingernails tapping decisively on the keyboard. Natalie stood there for 1 minute, then 2, each passing second underscoring Ashley's silent message. Natalie's presence here meant nothing. "Excuse me," Natalie said politely, steadying her voice. "Could you please tell me?" Before she could finish, Ashley raised a left hand to shoulder height in a clear, "be quiet" gesture. Her eyes never lifted to meet Natalie's. That single motion spoke volumes. "You don't matter here." A cold shiver ran down Natalie's spine. She wondered if this was all a misunderstanding, until seconds later the bank door swung open and a well-dressed white couple stepped inside. Immediately, Ashley looked up, her previously frosty expression melting into a radiant smile as she greeted them with unusually warm enthusiasm. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Pfizer. It's wonderful to see you again," Ashley chirped, rising gracefully. "We have a 2 o'clock appointment," the gentleman said, his tone courteous. "Is this the right time?" "Perfectly on schedule, sir. We're always thrilled to have you visit our branch," Ashley replied, deftly handing them 2 VIP cards. "Please head on through to the VIP lounge and I'll send someone with hot tea right away." Watching this unfold, Natalie felt her chest tighten. The disparity in treatment was painfully obvious. She glanced down at her simple leather shoes and unassuming office attire. There was no reason for her to be demeaned like this. Yet in Ashley's and her colleagues' eyes, it clearly wasn't enough. A young woman in a sleek corporate dress approached the desk next. Ashley pivoted immediately, her voice dripping with sweet cordiality. "Hello, ma'am. How can I help you today?" Natalie stood there invisible. She sensed the other employees occasionally glancing her way, then quickly looking away to avoid getting involved. It wasn't accidental. It was silent complicity. Jessica's coldness and Ashley's overt disdain were not isolated incidents, but evidence of an unspoken culture where people like Natalie were undervalued, suspected, and sidelined by bias and favoritism. Ashley flicked a final look at Natalie, this time with a faint challenging smile, as though to say, "You shouldn't waste your time here." A dull ache of indignation spread through Natalie, but she refused to fall into the trap of losing her composure. She reminded herself she would not accept defeat in the face of prejudice and injustice. Standing tall, her expression calm yet resolute, Natalie decided she would not leave until her rights and dignity were honored. She understood this silent battle would not be easy, but she would not give up because she was fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been ignored and dismissed with such cruel unfairness. Natalie knew that maintaining her composure in this stifling atmosphere wouldn't be easy, but she was determined not to let Ashley's attitude or anyone else's rob her of the dignity she deserved. Steeling herself with a deep breath, she returned to the teller station once more, hopeful that presenting all the required paperwork would finally settle things. The area was noticeably quieter now, and Natalie's eyes met Jessica's, the same teller who'd humiliated her just minutes earlier. Jessica glanced up from her screen, her expressions still cold and suspicious, as if Natalie's return were entirely unwelcome. Natalie laid the certified check on the counter and spoke in a measured, confident tone. "Here is the certified check from my partner. I'd like to deposit it into the company's account." Jessica didn't rush to reply. She leaned forward, scrutinizing the check under the harsh overhead lights, her eyes narrowing in doubt as though examining a contraband object. Without hiding her skepticism, she launched into a barrage of questions unrelated to the deposit itself. "What's the name of your company? How long have you been running it?" Natalie answered each question patiently, but Jessica's tone grew increasingly laced with sarcasm. "Where's your headquarters located? Do you have the original business registration? And by the way, why did you choose our bank?" Her inquiries followed no normal banking procedure. They existed solely to frustrate and delay. Jessica's appraisal roamed from Natalie's plain shoes and unbranded blazer to her hairstyle and the small purse in her hand. Every gesture dripped with contempt. At last, Jessica reluctantly picked up the check between thumb and forefinger as though it were filthy, peered at it again under the light, and cracked a half-smile of mockery. "Are you sure this is genuine?" she sneered. "It doesn't look trustworthy at all. I've seen plenty of people try to pass off phony checks, just like this." Natalie clenched her teeth, restraining the anger rising in her chest. She replied calmly, "This is a certified check from a reputable bank. You can verify it in your system." Instead of answering, Jessica leaned toward her colleague, Rachel, who'd been watching the exchange with amused detachment and murmured loud enough for Natalie to hear, "What do you think of this check? Looks just like the kind of fake paperwork they bring in here." Rachel shot Natalie a quick glance, her lips curling in agreement. "Yeah, you never know these days. Better be extra careful not to get fooled." Their stifled giggles, though hushed, were loud enough to carry. Nearby, customers cast curious glances at Natalie. A few whispered among themselves before turning away. But Natalie knew she had already been marked with suspicion. She felt as though she were standing center stage in a hostile arena, every eye dissecting her every move. Still, she refused to back down. She knew she'd done nothing wrong. Meeting Jessica's gaze head-on, Natalie's voice remained calm but unwavering. "I insist you verify this information thoroughly. This is a perfectly legitimate transaction, and I will not tolerate this insult." Jessica blinked, momentarily thrown by Natalie's firmness, then requested her habitual icy mask. With a grudging nod, she returned to her computer and began the verification process slowly and with obvious reluctance. In that tense silence, Natalie realized this wasn't merely a personal spat between her, Jessica, or Rachel. It was the manifestation of an entrenched, unspoken culture of bias, protected by the silent complicity of those around her. She was up against a closed system steeped in prejudice, and she would have to fight tenaciously to secure the fair treatment and respect she deserved. Standing her ground, eyes fixed on Jessica, Natalie braced herself for whatever came next. Knowing full well this was only the beginning of a bitter struggle, she was determined to win. As Jessica continued to move slowly and reluctantly through the verification on her computer, Natalie caught sight of a middle-aged man in a dark gray suit stepping out of the back office. His brow furrowed in irritation, as if disturbed during a break. His name tag read, Thomas Kent, branch manager. Natalie silently hoped he might resolve this troublesome situation quickly. Mr. Kent strode over his gaze, flicking over Natalie with cool detachment, before landing on Jessica with a clear look of inquiry. "What's going on here, Jessica? Is there an issue?" Instantly, Jessica's tone softened into unexpected politeness, a stark contrast to the harshness she'd shown Natalie. "Mr. Kent, this customer wants to deposit a rather large check, but I've noticed a few red flags, and the accompanying documentation isn't entirely clear. I thought I should get your opinion." Mr. Kent sighed impatiently, took the check from Jessica's outstretched hand, glanced at it for a few seconds, then pronounced his verdict in a curt, decisive voice. "I'm sorry, but with what we've been given, we can't process this transaction. There isn't enough evidence to verify its legitimacy." Each word felt like a blade against Natalie's self-respect. She immediately responded, her tone firm and precise. "Sir, I've provided every document required by your procedures. I truly do not understand why the bank can't verify such a clearly certified check." Mr. Kent arched an eyebrow, clearly displeased by her pushback. He looked her up and down, his eyes revealing open contempt. "The problem is, we need to ensure transactions are conducted by qualified clients. I'm afraid you haven't demonstrated that. Perhaps you'd be better served by another bank, one more suited to your needs." He then turned on his heel and strode back to his office, giving Natalie no opportunity to reply. The click of his leather shoes on the marble floor underscored his closed-minded finality. A stifling silence fell over the lobby. Natalie felt dozens of eyes assessing her. Jessica, still standing at the teller station, seized the moment to deepen the insult. She tilted her chin arrogantly and spoke loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "See, the issue here isn't just the paperwork. Honestly, looking at your clothes, your shoes, and that purse, you're not exactly the type we expect doing business at this bank." A few covert laughs rippled behind Natalie. A young white woman covered her mouth with her hand, eyes glinting with discreet amusement. A man nodded and smirked in Jessica's direction, clearly in agreement. The bank lobby had become a stage where Natalie was the unwitting spectacle. Humiliation washed over her in waves. Every stare, every chuckle stabbed at her pride. But she refused to collapse. She stood tall, her gaze steady and sharp, even as her heart ached at their vicious cruelty. Jessica's triumphant smile betrayed her satisfaction at Natalie's silence. She leaned into Rachel, who'd watched since the beginning with cold amusement, and whispered something that made Jessica chuckle softly. Both women reveled in the malicious delight of publicly shaming an innocent person. With deliberate calm, Natalie gathered her check and papers. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve held firm. She understood that this was no longer merely a personal affront. It was a battle for basic dignity and respect that everyone deserves. Before turning to leave, Natalie fixed Jessica with a clear, unhurried gaze and spoke each word with quiet strength. "Remember what you said today. There will come a time when you'll have to face those words again. And when you do, I promise, I won't be the one." feeling ashamed. Then she walked toward the exit without looking back. Behind her, the whisper continued, but they no longer mattered. As the bank doors swung open and the brilliant sunlight outside flooded in, Natalie felt only a cold brightness, an echo of the discrimination she just endured. Stepping out, she knew she had experienced a profound humiliation, but also that she would return, and next time, she would not remain silent. Stepping out of the banks, Natalie felt that the sunshine outside wasn't nearly warm enough to melt the chill in her heart. The glass doors clicking shut behind her felt like a full stop on the patience she'd managed to hold on to until now. But in that moment of despair, she realized that silence or passive endurance in the face of prejudice and injustice could not be her answer. The deep wound she'd just suffered would never fade if she simply walked away and quietly accepted it. Back at her office, Natalie closed the door firmly, sank into her familiar leather chair, and stared down at the neatly arranged file before her. It contained the $2.3 billion contract her company, Coleman Construction, had just signed with Stratton Financial itself. Her gaze lingered on the signature line at the bottom. Natalie Coleman, Chief Executive Officer. She knew exactly where her true worth lay, and she refused to let anyone treat her with the contempt she had just endured. That night, Natalie barely slept. She sat at her desk through the early hours, assembling every piece of documentation, the signed contract, company folders, even a direct confirmation letter from Stratton Financial's board of directors. Each crisp page in black ink reaffirmed one undeniable fact. She was the CEO of a leading construction firm and a strategic partner to the bank. Natalie understood that her return would be a formidable confrontation, but this time she wouldn't beg. She would demand the respect and justice she deserved. The next morning, Natalie strode back into Stratton Financial. She'd chosen a sharply tailored black suit, meticulously polished heels, and a sleek updo, undeniable symbols of executive authority. Pushing open the glass doors, she walked straight inside. Those who'd mocked her the day before shot curious, surprised glances as she passed. Ignoring their stares, Natalie went directly to the reception desk where Ashley sat. Ashley looked up momentarily, taken aback, but quickly slipped back into her indifferent mask. This time, Natalie didn't wait to be dismissed. She spoke in a calm, commanding voice. "I'd like to see the branch manager, Mr. Thomas Kent, right now." Ashley hesitated at Natalie's resolute tone. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Kent is very busy. I'm certain he'll want to meet with me," Natalie interrupted, placing her business card on the desk. "Please hand it to him immediately. I trust he understands the importance of this matter." Reluctantly, Ashley picked up the card and glanced at it. Her face shifted from aloof to astonished as she read, "Natalie Coleman, CEO, Coleman Construction Group." Without meeting Natalie's eyes, Ashley hurried off toward the manager's office. Moments later, the door burst open and Thomas Kent emerged, his expression a mix of confusion and alarm. "Miss Coleman, I never expected," he stammered, eyes wide. "I'm sure you'd rather hear this in person," Natalie replied, her voice crisp and authoritative. With no choice, Kent led her inside his private office and closed the door. Natalie placed the stack of documents, contracts, confirmations, and credentials on his desk. Kent flipped through them, growing visibly pale as he recognized her identity and the crucial role she played in his bank's $2.3 billion deal. "Miss Coleman, I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice trembling. Natalie held his gaze. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here so you understand this. Yesterday's treatment was unacceptable. Your bank humiliated a key partner, and there will be serious consequences unless you and your team acknowledge your wrongdoing. Kent sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the desk. In that charged silence, Natalie knew her words had landed. As she rose to leave, Natalie paused at the door, turned back, and spoke with crystal-clearer conviction. Mr. Kent, I'm leaving today not as a humiliated customer, but as a partner granting your bank a final chance to make this right. I trust you are wise enough to know what comes next. With that, the door closed softly behind her. Walking away, Natalie felt she'd regained more than her dignity. She had forced those who scorned her to confront the ugly prejudice they had assumed was acceptable. She needed nothing more to know she would return, and next time, she would not remain silent. The branch manager's office door closed behind her as Natalie walked away with her head held high, though a dull fire of disappointment still smoldered in her chest. She knew, however, that to truly set things right, she needed to see someone with more authority, someone who understood the full value of the contract and the severe fallout if their partnership were damaged. One name immediately came to mind, Michael Andrews, Regional Vice President of Stratton Financial. That very afternoon, Natalie secured an urgent appointment with Mr. Andrews' office, stressing that the matter was critical and directly tied to the bank's $2.3 billion deal. Less than 30 minutes later, it was confirmed. Andrews' office occupied the top floor of the bank's headquarters, its walls adorned with abstract art, and its glass windows offering a sweeping view of downtown Raleigh. Natalie entered with quiet confidence. No grand gestures, just her poised presence and professional attire, drawing Andrews' immediate attention as he sat at the head of a large conference table. Good afternoon, Miss Coleman. I understand you have an urgent matter to discuss. Andrews greeted her, his tone polite but edged with curiosity and caution. Wasting no time on pleasantries, Natalie opened her leather briefcase, withdrew the dossier, and placed it before him. Mr. Andrews, I believe you need to review this contract again. It directly involves my company, Coleman Construction Group, the strategic partner on your bank's $2.3 billion project. Andrews raised an eyebrow. His expression shifted from reserved to intrigued as he took the file, carefully flipping through each page. His eyes widened, and his hand trembled ever so slightly when he reached the signature line. Natalie Coleman, Chief Executive Officer, directly beneath his own signature as the bank's representative. For a heartbeat, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Andrews looked up at Natalie, his face drained of color as the gravity of his staff's misconduct registered fully. Miss Coleman, I can't believe this. Is this real? He finally whispered, voice wavering. Natalie met his gaze steadily. Mr. Andrews, I never imagined I'd have to stand here and reaffirm what your bank should have recognized from the start. Stratton Financial treated me like I didn't belong, despite the fact that I signed an agreement worth billions in profit for you. Andrews sank back in his chair, eyes tracing the contract's lines as though seeking some excuse in the fine print, yet finding none. He knew better than anyone the fallout such an error could trigger for the bank. Not only financial loss, but the long-lasting stain on Stratton Financial's reputation. I honestly don't know how to excuse my team's behavior, Andrews admitted, tension cutting through his words. Please understand, I had no idea this was happening. Natalie's lips curved in a slight knowing shake of her head. Her eyes sharp, yet not without empathy for the man before her, held firm. Mr. Andrews, the issue isn't just ignorance. It's the culture and mindset within your bank where bias and discrimination are silently tolerated. Andrews had no response. The hush in the glass-walled room magnified the ticking clock, each tick serving as a reminder of his helplessness in the face of Natalie's pinpoint indictment. Finally, she rose and straightened her blazer with deliberate calm. I'm not here to threaten your bank. I'm here to give you a chance to correct this injustice before it's beyond repair. But know this. Unless there is a fundamental shift in attitude and culture here, Stratton Financial will lose far more than this one crucial contract. For the first time since she'd entered, Andrews looked up at her with genuine respect. Miss Coleman, I will see to it that this is resolved immediately and thoroughly. You have my word. Natalie nodded once, turned on her heel, and left. Her departure leaving Andrews to confront the full weight of her words. When the door clicked shut behind her, she knew she had forced him to face the painful truth he and his institution had long ignored. As she strode down the long corridor, Natalie felt her own strength and worth more clearly than ever. She understood that the battle was far from over, but she would no longer stay silent. And that was the first step toward real change. The moment Natalie closed Michael Andrews' office door behind her, an undercurrent of tension began to spread through every corner of Stratton Financial. Curious glances and murmured whispers multiplied by the minute, turning normally quiet hallways into zones buzzing with unease. No one knew exactly what had transpired behind closed doors, but the hollow ashen look on the regional vice president's face as he emerged was all the confirmation they needed. Less than an hour later, senior leadership ordered an immediate internal investigation. Every transaction record, security camera feed, and internal phone call was scrutinized. All staff involved in the incident were summoned to explain their actions at once. Jessica, the once confident teller who'd so brazenly insulted Natalie, now sat before the bank's leadership committee. Her arrogance stripped away. She stumbled through feeble, contradictory excuses. But when the surveillance footage played on the big screen, showing her contemptuously dropping Natalie's ID on the floor, any remaining pretense evaporated. She was visibly shaken, unable to defend herself against such damning evidence. Rachel, Jessica's close colleague, initially tried to deny any wrongdoing. But when recordings of her own hateful comments were replayed, her face went pale, and she fell silent. Remarks she dismissed as harmless banter now stood as ironclad proof of deep-seated bias within the bank, something she'd never imagined would be exposed. Yet the most serious case was that of branch manager Thomas Kent. He sat tense and exhausted, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Testimony and video evidence laid bare his apathy and failure to intervene when his employees discriminated against a customer. Leadership confronted him with a question he couldn't answer. As branch manager, how could you allow such blatant discrimination to occur under your watch? He bowed his head, cold sweat beading on his forehead, fully aware that his career could be destroyed in an instant by his own negligence and complicity. Meanwhile, at the reception desk, Ashley faced an internal storm of outrage. As the first employee to interact with Natalie, and the one who showed the most blatant contempt, She found no defense for her cold demeanor once the surveillance and eyewitness statements came to light. Under immense pressure, she submitted her resignation within 2 days and quietly left the bank, unable to endure the fallout. Stratton Financial's leadership responded swiftly and without mercy. For the first time in the bank's history, a special internal bulletin was issued declaring a zero-tolerance policy for any form of prejudice or discrimination, however minor. Every line of that announcement served as a stern warning to anyone harboring bias or disdain. That evening, Michael Andrews convened an urgent all-staff meeting. Standing before a silent room, his voice grave and authoritative, he declared that the recent events were utterly unacceptable and that the bank would not tolerate anyone, intentional or not, insulting a customer, especially a key partner like Natalie Coleman. "We've made a grievous mistake," Andrews emphasized, his eyes sweeping the room. "From this moment on, I want each of you to reflect deeply. Have you ever exhibited similar attitudes? If so, change immediately before it's too late." When the meeting ended, the atmosphere at Stratton Financial had irrevocably shifted. Employees filed out with bowed heads and heavy thoughts, each one keenly aware that seemingly small, thoughtless actions can carry devastating consequences. As Michael Andrews walked the now quiet corridors, he recognized that the bank had just endured a painful lesson, but also that it was a necessary turning point to ensure Stratton Financial would never repeat such a grave error. Immediately after the emergency meeting ended, the atmosphere at Stratton Financial shifted to an almost suffocating tension. Michael Andrews, the regional vice president, realized that this crisis wasn't merely the fault of a few individuals. It was the clearest sign yet of a toxic corporate culture that had long gone unchecked. In his private office, Michael sat in silence, reviewing the freshly completed internal reports. The documented incidents of racial bias, customer contempt, and discriminatory attitudes were not isolated mistakes but symptoms of a system lacking rigorous oversight. He understood all too well that without sweeping reforms, the bank would face even graver consequences down the line. Within days, an official notice went out to every branch. Stratton Financial would not tolerate any form of prejudice or discrimination, and a far stricter control process would take effect immediately. The first step was to suspend and, in some cases, terminate the staff directly involved or complicit in the recent events. Jessica, whose actions were clearly captured on security footage, was dismissed on the spot. She left the bank in silence, her former arrogance replaced by shame and regret. Rachel, who had egged Jessica on with her own derogatory remarks, was placed on indefinite suspension and required to attend in-depth diversity and anti-racism training. She sat in a closed-deed door or meeting room, stunned as leadership delivered stern lectures, realizing for the first time that her casual laughter at another's pain was no mere slip of decorum, but a serious offense. Perhaps the most drastic action fell on Thomas Kent, the branch manager. After a tense board review, he was demoted and reassigned to an administrative support role. Stripped of the authority he once wielded in his new cramped office, he stared at his trembling hands, fully aware that his career had been derailed by his own silence and indifference. Meanwhile, Ashley, the receptionist who had shown Natalie the most blatant contempt, resigned under the weight of internal outrage. Her abrupt departure served as a stark warning to all staff. No one would be allowed to enable or ignore discrimination, even in its smallest form. With personnel actions completed, Stratton Financial launched mandatory diversity and anti-discrimination training across the entire organization. From seminars and workshops to urgent round discussions, every employee, from senior executives to new hires, was required to participate. Leading experts were brought in to teach staff how to recognize unconscious bias, practice respectful interactions, and appreciate the paramount importance of equity in every client encounter. At the same time, the bank restructured its internal controls. A new oversight division was established, reporting directly to senior leadership, tasked with monitoring customer fairness and reporting any suspicious transactions or discriminatory behavior immediately for resolution. Michael Andrews personally oversaw these initiatives, stressing in every meeting that culture and attitudes don't change overnight, but by starting today, we ensure this painful mistake can never be repeated. Within a week, the face of Stratton Financial had transformed. Guest smiles and averted eyes were replaced by a focused professionalism and heightened vigilance. Employees began engaging with clients more sincerely, as if every transaction were being watched by the bank itself. Back in his private office, Michael reviewed the reorganization files with a measure of relief. But he knew this was only the beginning. Those forceful changes had laid the groundwork, but rebuilding trust and reputation would take sustained effort. Above all, the bank needed to cultivate an environment where every customer, regardless of who they were or how they looked or dressed, felt genuinely respected. As he left the office later that day, walking down the brightly lit corridors, Michael felt a rare peace, interwoven with hope. Hope that Stratton Financial's most painful lesson would propel it toward a stronger, fairer future. The sweeping changes at Stratton Financial didn't just shake the bank's internal ranks. They also triggered unexpected transformations in the lives of those who had been at the heart of the scandal. Once the bank doors closed behind them, Jessica, Rachel, and Thomas Kent found themselves forced to reckon with the consequences of behaviors and assumptions they had long taken for granted. Jessica's reckoning. Jessica, who once stood at the teller window with icy self-assurance, now wandered the busy streets in a daze, her former confidence and arrogance completely shattered. After being fired, she faced a stretch of unemployment. And it was during that time that the true impact of her discriminatory actions hit her hardest. One morning, she stumbled across a volunteer notice from the Equal Access Foundation, a local nonprofit dedicated to helping minority communities obtain fair financial services. On impulse, she signed up initially just to assuage her guilt. But the more she worked alongside people who'd experienced the same contempt she had once shown, the more she grasped how deeply her cold indifference had hurt them. Before long, Jessica became a devoted volunteer, spending most days guiding minority residents through budgeting plans, opening bank accounts, and applying for loans on equal footing. One afternoon, she sat beside an elderly African-American woman, trembling at a bank entrance, terrified she'd be turned away. Watching the woman's fear, Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She finally felt the full weight of the suffering her attitude had caused. Rachel's confession and growth. Rachel, Jessica's former colleague and co-conspirator in mocking Natalie, underwent a similarly profound transformation. She publicly posted an open letter on social media, bravely admitting her wrongdoing. In that letter, she expressed deep shame and remorse for failing to recognize just how damaging her discriminatory remarks had been. Her apology spread quickly, earning praise and forgiveness from many, especially from those who'd faced the same prejudice. Not stopping there, Rachel enrolled in an intensive corporate diversity and anti-racism program. At every session, she took meticulous notes and asked pointed questions to truly understand unconscious bias. Late nights spent poring over research materials revealed to her how prejudice can lurk in the smallest, seemingly harmless actions, and yet wound people deeply. Rachel emerged from the training determined to become an advocate against the very biases she once ignored, viewing it as her responsibility to make amends. Thomas Kent's redemption. Thomas Kent, the once powerful branch manager, found himself under a prolonged, grueling internal investigation. Evidence of his negligence and tacit complicity grew too strong to deny. After weeks of stress and reflection, he was stripped of his managerial title and reassigned to an administrative support role, losing the authority he'd once wielded so proudly. Yet in those darkest days, Thomas realized that losing prestige hurt less than losing one's self-respect. He joined the Community Business Initiative, a small organization supporting minority-owned small businesses. For the first time in his career, he faced the very obstacles he'd once overlooked. Each day, as he counseled young entrepreneurs of color on securing loans and expanding their markets, Thomas understood firsthand the invisible barriers they faced simply because of their backgrounds. One late afternoon, sitting with an ambitious young black man repeatedly denied credit. Thomas remembered Natalie Coleman's resilience and pain. He finally grasped the helplessness and insult his own apathy had inflicted. In the quiet of his modest office, Thomas vowed to spend the rest of his career helping those once marginalized. It became his path not just to atone, but to rediscover the true purpose of his work and life. A journey from wrong to right. Jessica, Rachel, and Thomas each embarked on painful yet hopeful journeys of transformation. They learned that true redemption isn't just a matter of saying sorry, but requires concrete, heartfelt action to heal the wounds they caused. And from these serious missteps, all three found a new, truer calling, one that allowed them to change their own lives while helping build a fairer, more humane society. While those who had once harmed Natalie were beginning their journeys of atonement, Natalie quietly stepped into a new chapter, not through retaliation or seeking glory from the scandal, but by pouring her energy into a far more meaningful mission. In the days immediately after the incident, Natalie fielded dozens of calls from reporters and local media, all eager to exploit the headline-grabbing story of a black woman CEO mistreated in downtown Raleigh. But Natalie politely declined every interview. She knew that retelling her own suffering wouldn't uproot the entrenched biases at play unless she turned to concrete action. Instead of speaking to the press, she set to work, building a passion project called Empower the Future, an intensive training program in leadership, financial management, and capital access tailored specifically for women and young entrepreneurs of color in Raleigh. The program's aim went beyond imparting basic skills. Natalie wanted participants to cultivate the confidence and resilience needed to shatter the invisible barriers they faced every day. The early rollout wasn't without its challenges. Yet Natalie refused to back down. She personally led each session, sharing candid stories from her own experience of being turned away, dismissed, doubted, to show her students that these obstacles weren't unique to them and that how they responded was the most crucial factor. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, young people from across the region flocked to her classes, their eyes alight with determination. Many had grown discouraged after being denied loans because of their names or skin color. Others had been consistently underestimated at work because of their gender or appearance. One afternoon, after class ended, a 23-year-old student named Kesha waited until all the chairs were stacked. Strong and poised as always, Kesha's usually steady gaze now shimmered with emotion as she approached Natalie. "Miss Coleman," she said, her voice catching. "Today was the first time I walked into a bank feeling truly confident. Not because I was sure they'd approve my loan, but because I finally understood my own worth. I want you to know this program has changed my life." Natalie felt a lump in her throat. In that moment, she realized her decision to teach went far beyond sharing knowledge. It was about giving young people the conviction that they were fully deserving of every opportunity they pursued. Before long, Empower the Future expanded into other underserved neighborhoods across the city. Local news began featuring stories of young entrepreneurs who for the first time secured financing, of new women leaders of color finding their footing in major firms. Community and civic leaders took notice. But rather than leverage the attention for personal acclaim, Natalie funneled every resource back into free classes, startup grants, and a mentorship network so that alumni could support one another. At the program's first graduation ceremony, Natalie stood on a modest stage before hundreds of determined faces. Her voice rang out clear and strong. "I once believed silence was the best response to injustice. But today, looking at all of you, I understand that our most powerful reply to bias and discrimination isn't vengeance. It's each of us achieving success with courage and conviction." Her words echoed through the hall. As she spoke, Natalie spotted a familiar figure standing quietly at the back. Thomas Kent. In his hand, he held a small folder from the Community Business Initiative, and his eyes were fixed on Natalie with a mixture of gratitude and remorse. He gave her a gentle nod, an unspoken thank you for the change she'd sparked not just in the community but in him. The ceremony ended, but its ripple effect only grew. Natalie walked slowly through the bustling hallway, her heart brimming with joy and unwavering belief that she was on the right path. She had not only healed her own wounds, but had become a catalyst for healing in others. That night, as the city lights dimmed, Natalie sat quietly by her window, gazing out at the skyline. She knew this story was no longer just hers. It had become the spark that gave so many young people from marginalized communities a voice and a place in society. And in that realization, she found the greatest victory she could ever wish for. Natalie's steadfast, quiet efforts gradually created a far-reaching impact beyond anything she had originally anticipated. Not only did young people from underserved communities take notice, but even the very organizations that had once stood on the opposite side of her story began to recognize the powerful positive changes she was bringing about. One morning, while seated in the modest office of Empower the Future, Natalie received an official envelope from the Raleigh Business Association. She was startled to see Stratton Financial's familiar logo on the letterhead. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the envelope and quickly read its contents. It was an invitation for Natalie to serve as the keynote speaker at the city's annual conference for entrepreneurs and business leaders. At the bottom of the letter was Michael Andrews' signature, the same Michael Andrews who had witnessed and addressed the bank's discriminatory incident. What surprised Natalie wasn't the honor of the invitation itself, but the profound shift in perception by the very bank that had once harmed her. Despite initial reluctance, Natalie decided to accept. She understood that this would be more than just a speech to a crowd. It was a crucial opportunity to amplify her message of equality, trust, and mutual respect. On the day of the conference, the ballroom of the Raleigh Center Hotel brimmed with entrepreneurs and top executives from companies big and small. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers reflected off their polished attire, creating an atmosphere of elegance and tension. Amid the crowd, Natalie easily spotted Michael Andrews in the front row, his eyes filled with respect and clear expectation. Next to him sat Thomas Kent and Jessica, their faces a mix of anticipation, shame, and regret as they recalled past events. The MC stepped to the podium and announced formally, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker today, Miss Natalie Coleman, CEO of Coleman Construction Group and founder of the Empower the Future program." The audience erupted in warm applause as Natalie took the stage, her expression calm and confident. For a brief moment, her gaze swept over those who had once belittled her. Yet there was no trace of blame in her eyes. She knew she was not here to revisit painful memories, but to guide everyone toward a better, different future. Adjusting the microphone, Natalie paused for a few seconds, letting the room fall completely silent before speaking in a clear, resonant voice. "Today, I will not speak about myself, nor will I recount what happened in the past. Instead, I invite each of us to consider a simple question, one that has the power to transform the way we treat one another." All eyes turned to her, expectant. She smiled gently, then asked her question deliberately and powerfully. How would our world change if we trusted one another from the very first moment we heard who someone truly is? An unusual hush fell across the room, a question so simple yet so profound, reaching into the very core of every person seated there. Michael Andrews bowed his head, his eyes reflective with deep thought, recalling the grave mistake of not trusting Natalie upon their first meeting. Thomas Kent sat motionless, his hands clenched, painfully aware of the cost of the doubt and disdain he had once directed at her. At the back of the room, Jessica quietly wiped away tears, realizing that had she trusted Natalie, she might never have lost her job and her self-respect so bitterly. Others in the audience felt a pang of conscience, questioning whether they too had ever acted in the same way. Natalie said nothing further. She simply stood there, allowing the weight of her question to sink deeply into every soul present. After a full minute, the first gentle applause broke the silence, and then it spread like wildfire, filling the ballroom with unequivocal support for her message. As she stepped down from the stage, Michael Andrews rose and approached her, eyes more sincere than Natalie had ever seen. "Thank you, Natalie. What you said not only helped me understand you better, but also helped me understand myself in the bank I represent." Natalie nodded warmly, her gaze kind yet resolute. "We all can change, Mr. Andrews. The real question is, do we have the courage to begin by trusting each other's worth and character?" Andrews remained silent, nodding deeply, fully aware that this was the greatest lesson of his managerial career. Natalie walked down the long corridor, feeling more at peace than ever. That day, Raleigh's business community witnessed not just the brilliance of a resilient female CEO, but to an even greater extent. They began to examine their own consciences and fundamentally shift how they perceived and treated others. And Natalie, once a wounded victim, had ascended to the highest level of recognition, not through retribution, but through a single powerful question capable of changing the very world she lived in. When she stepped out of the hall, Natalie knew her story no longer belonged to her alone. Though she'd never agreed to press interviews or media appearances, what she'd set in motion resonated more powerfully than any article ever could. In the days after the conference, Natalie's small Empower the Future office was flooded with letters and emails. They came not only from young entrepreneurs and members of minority communities, but also from those who had once been on the other side of her story. People whose actions and attitudes had wronged her. One early morning, Natalie opened her inbox and paused over an email bearing the simple subject line, "A heartfelt apology from Thomas Kent." In the message, Thomas wrote thoughtfully and sincerely, offering no excuses or evasions. "Dear Miss Coleman, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I need you to know I fully recognize my mistake. My attitude and neglect back then caused you deep pain. I am committed to spending the rest of my life fighting the invisible biases that once blinded me and so many others. Thank you for opening my eyes." A few days later, another carefully handwritten letter arrived at her office. This one from Ashley, the receptionist who'd initially greeted Natalie with cold indifference. Her note was brief but brimming with remorse. "Hello, Miss Coleman. I've thought endlessly about how I treated you. There's no justification for my indifference. I want you to know I've begun a new chapter where I remind myself every day to treat everyone with kindness and respect. I will never forget the lesson you inadvertently taught me about compassion and trust." Reading these words, Natalie allowed herself a quiet, relieved smile. She never sought revenge or even an apology from those who had hurt her, but seeing genuine change in those who had once been wrong filled her with warmth and consolation like nothing else. Around the same time, she learned that Stratton Financial, under Michael Andrews' direct leadership, had enacted sweeping internal reforms. The bank made diversity awareness and anti-racism training mandatory for every employee. Beyond Stratton, many of Raleigh's other major financial institutions and businesses reached out to Natalie, eager to launch their own versions of the Empower the Future program. Before long, even without mainstream press coverage on Natalie's story spread quietly but powerfully. It became a beacon inspiring deep shifts in community awareness. Organizations and companies began to reflect inwardly, earnestly discussing the hidden biases in their systems, issues they'd long ignored, whether intentionally or not. Several weeks later, on a tranquil weekend afternoon, Natalie sat alone in her modest office. She realized that the very hardship she'd endured had become the greatest momentum behind real lasting change. She no longer felt pain or anger, but a profound sense of peace and pride. She picked up another reentrant letter from a young Stratton Financial employee she never met. "Dear Miss Coleman, though we've never met, I had to tell you how much your story and actions have transformed our work environment. We now serve every client with an awareness of their inherent value with no room for the discrimination we once accepted." My colleagues and I are sincerely grateful to you for blazing this path of change." Natalie folded the letter and gazed out the window, feeling deep tranquility wash over her. She understood her story had transcended personal boundaries. It had become a catalyst prompting people to examine themselves and their community. She knew the journey had never been easy. But Natalie also recognized she was not alone. Around her stood thousands of young people, entrepreneurs and employees of companies big and small, all walking together toward a world without bias or discrimination. For Natalie, that was the most meaningful outcome of all. And in the quiet of that afternoon, she realized the question she once posed at the conference had become more than a message. It was the strongest conviction of hers and those around her. How would our world change if we trusted who someone is from the very first moment they introduce themselves? She knew that question would continue to echo, spurring individuals to reflect and transform, rippling out across society and driving a powerful turning point in the fight against racism and social prejudice she had so quietly championed. If you found this story meaningful, please hit like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to continue joining us for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching and see you in the next videos.